Summer 1945. The Nazi German Reich has been defeated and is now trapped in a huge cage. Inside that cage are millions of Nazi beasts and tens of millions of their helpers. How do you identify them? And when you do you go after them or try to get them to join you as the chilling effects of a Cold War with your allies begin to be felt? Simply put, do you denazify Germany or try to tame the Nazi beast to work for you? This is episode 141 of War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus, Olsson. The Allies have taken control of a population of 80 million people whose country, the expanded Nazi German Reich, has committed a war of aggression on all of Europe and perpetrated on an industrial scale the most numerous atrocities in recorded history. This barbarity has been based on what can only be described as insane delusions and paranoid fantasies of a racial war for world domination. The vast majority of the Reich population, between 60 and 80%, have bought into this collective madness. Arguably, occupied Germany and Austria is an insane asylum, and if Europe shall ever be safe and humanity restored, the Allies must find a cure for tens of millions of aiders and abettors of sadism and mass murder. Back in February at the Yalta Conference, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and US President Franklin Roosevelt drove for a harsh plan that included the dismemberment of Germany into several smaller nations and arguably the complete elimination of a unified German identity and economic power from Europe. Several points were decided for how to handle denazification and demilitarization and the prosecution of perpetrators of war crimes and what would soon become known as crimes against humanity. On the US side, the decision at Yalta led to the Morgenthau Plan for how to handle the US occupation zone. This plan was so harsh that former President Herbert Hoover, a leadership figure in international humanitarian aid programs, post his presidency, estimated that it would cost up to 25 million German lives through starvation and disease. Then Roosevelt died. Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee in the UK summer elections, and the crass reality of occupation post-war international needs and the first gusts of the chilling winds of the Cold War between the still Allied nations began to be felt. It looked increasingly likely that Germany would be two countries, divided between and allied to the USSR and the Western Allies respectively. Already on May 10th, US President Harry S. Truman scrapped the Morgenthau Plan, leaving only some of the harsh economic ideas in place for the directive on how to handle occupation. Finally, at the Potsdam Conference from July to August 1945, a significantly less harsh treatment plan to cure Nazi disease Germany was set in motion based on 4 points: demilitarization, denazification, decentralization, and democratization. To some degree, a fifth D, deindustrialization, was still part of the cure. Now in August, step 1 of the treatment program is underway to locate the main carriers of disease and isolate them from having any influence over German society. The goal of this first step in denazification should really be split into 2 components. The first is the pursuit and punishment of the high-ranking Nazis and military leaders guilty of ordering and or committing atrocities. For this, the Allies have settled on an international military tribunal to be held in Nuremberg beginning in October 1945. There is also a model for justice for the lower-level accused war criminals, at least where matters have not already been settled through judicial or extrajudicial punishment on the battlefield or in prison camps. These cases are mainly left to the judiciary and law enforcement of the aggrieved nation to extradite the perpetrator. We've covered the beginnings of the hunt for Nazi perpetrators to some degree in other episodes, and I will return to this part of the post-war events when I cover the trials of the international tribunals in Europe and Asia this coming autumn. The second part of the first goal of denazification is to remove Nazi ideology completely from German population and to deal with what they see as a fundamental tendency towards authoritarianism and militarism within German society and psyche. To begin that process, they need to separate out the actual Nazis from those who generally agreed with Nazi madness without effectively acting on it, and of course the minority who were opposed to Nazism. A significant issue here is that almost all of Germany's civil servants and higher echelons of private enterprise are part of the Nazi infection. Now that the Allies have decided that Germany will not be obliterated, they need the German people to restore social order, fix infrastructure like roads, bridges, and water supplies, at least rebuild the subsistence economy, and set up some sort of civic administration. To quantify the problem, 8 million people were members of the now banned Nazi Party, and 45 million were members of some Nazi auxiliary group like the Reich Labor Front, the National Socialist Women's League, or the Hitler Youth. The question quickly becomes one of where the line should be drawn. As we shall see, each Allied power has a slightly different interpretation. The Americans take what is arguably the strictest view. After the German surrender on May 10, 1945, the United States Group Control Council, the USGCC, implements an order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This order, JCS 1067, states that all members of the Nazi Party who have been more than nominal participants in its activities, all active supporters of Nazism or militarism, and all other persons hostile to Allied purposes will be removed and excluded from public office and from positions of importance in quasi-public and private enterprises. To figure out who was more than nominal or an active supporter of Nazism, all four powers begin a screening program of German citizens. As we shall see, these are highly varied in scope and methods and reflective of fundamental disagreements among the powers. In the American zone, this screening is done through the Fragebogen, or Questionnaire program, which is centered on a 6-page form with 131 questions about a German respondent's Nazi past. The new Fragebogen asks questions about membership in Nazi-affiliated organizations, past employment, income, military service, writings and speeches, foreign travel, and anti-Nazi activities, and one on secondary and higher education, in which respondents listed every school they had attended since they were children, as well as membership in student organizations. It was believed that enrollment in a politicized school, for instance, Adolf Hitler Schule, or admission to a university after March 1939, indicated National Socialist beliefs. Respondents were also asked if they had been admitted into a profession or trade since 1935, which, according to public safety, suggested they were viewed by the regime as politically reliable. This form is adopted as a SHAEF standard, so on paper at least, both British and French troops should distribute it. But in practice, things are a bit different, with the British using an earlier, shorter version rejected by the Americans back in August 1944 as too soft. In particular, this earlier form took a more lenient view towards membership in Nazi-affiliated organizations. For their part, the Soviets sometimes use American Fragebogen either in the original English-German or translated into Russian-German, but more often they use their own forms drafted in the field. When it comes to administering the Fragebogen, the process works something like this. And bear in mind, this is an enormous simplification of a program that goes through several revisions and is implemented differently by each Allied power. Standard procedure is to order all mayors, police chiefs, and industry managers to distribute the forms to the men and women they employ. Any German wishing to work for the Allied military government as a translator, clerk, or secretary, for example, must also fill out the form. In some cases, troops supervised as employees are gathered together to fill out the forms on site. In other cases, the forms are taken away and must be returned within 5 days to the nearest military government office. The Americans set about the work with particular zeal. In Frankfurt am Main, they ordered 2,000 residents to fill out the survey over a 6-day period. After this, the Americans dismissed 431 people from municipal office. In June, the American commander for Bavaria brags that in just 4 weeks, his office has processed almost 4,000 of the surveys. And although the French are in general less energetic than the Americans, French authorities in Karlsruhe and Baden-Baden ordered 10,000 men aged between 18 and 65 to fill out the survey in just 1 day. Once a Fragebogen has been completed, it's up to Schaef's Public Safety Office to investigate the applicant's answers. First, the form is checked against one of Schaef's black lists of names for automatic arrest. Those whose form make it through are checked for membership of paramilitary groups like the SA and SS, an official rank in the Nazi Party, and membership of dozens of auxiliary groups like the Hitler Youth and Reichsleber Service. Those who joined the Nazi Party before Hitler's seizure of power in 1933 are considered committed Nazis and automatically barred from working in the civil administration. Of course, people sometimes lie when answering these forms, so questionnaires are checked against available Nazi Party records, intelligence service reports, civil service records, newspapers, and statements by local informants. Those who deliberately falsify information receive punishments ranging from fines to prison sentences of up to 5 years. Verification of Nazi Party membership becomes far simpler in November 1945 when all 10 million names on the membership roll comes into Allied possession, having been saved by an anti-Nazi industrialist. Once they have been assessed, the applicant is placed in one of 4 categories which act as recommendations for current or future employment eligibility. These are: removal or non-appointment is mandatory. Removal or non-appointment is discretionary. No objection to retention or appointment. Retention or appointment is recommended. Now, despite the looming reality that there will be a West and East Germany within these 2 emerging Germanys are 4 separately governed occupation zones, with denazification passing to the individual Allied powers. Although there is an attempt to adopt uniform policies of denazification through the Allied Control Commission, it is here that we see the final split between the various approaches. For their part, the Americans stepped things up another level. By September 1945, 325,000 forms have been completed in Bavaria alone, and the Office for the Military Government for Germany is drowning in a sea of paper. There is some notable criticism about the scale of the project, including from General Patton. At a press conference on September 22nd, he tells reporters that he doesn't see the need for this denazification thing. Fragebogen, what the hell is a Fragebogen? He says sarcastically. This prompts the New York Times to write that General Patton belittles the very purpose for which the war in Europe was fought, namely the denazification of Germany. In response to this public relations crisis, military governor of the United States Zone, General Lucius Clay, and his assistant deputy, Major General Clarence Adcock, sketch out a more severe denazification law. This is rushed through on September 26, after less than a day of drafting. Known as Law Number 8, the legislation greatly intensifies the vetting process in the American zone. Everyone working in any sector of the economy other than agriculture must complete a Fragebogen. In just 1 month, more than 600,000 surveys are submitted in the American zone, forcing OMGUS to desperately hire more German civilians to process the forms. In an ironic twist of fate, even former Nazi Party members are hired to conduct denazification. The British continue with a more restrained and somewhat skeptical approach. Not only do the British fear economic collapse in their zone, but they are less sensitive to press criticism than their American counterparts. As such, there is no British equivalent to the American Law Number 8, and they never extend the Fragebogen purge to private industry. Still, doctors, nurses, midwives, journalists, university professors, teachers, postal and railway workers, municipal clerks, all of them must complete the Fragebogen. Over the next couple of years, 2 million questionnaires are filled out in the British zone. In both Anglo-American zones, the Fragebogen becomes an unavoidable part of German life, as a journalist writing for The Scotsman in June 1946 will report. One of the phrases most frequently met in Germany today is the German word Fragebogen, meaning questionnaire. The word is used as if it were English, and an official will ask, "Has this man been Fragebogened?" These questions play, in fact, a most important part in Germany under Allied control. By volume, the French military administration is even more zealous than the Americans. About 670,000 Fragebogen are processed by the French. This is the highest portion of any occupying power, given that the French zone has the lowest population of about 4 million people. However, the French take a more nuanced approach than the Americans or the British, designing at least 20 questionnaires for individual professions. For their part, the Soviets tend to clear out leading Nazis while showing leniency towards those at the bottom of the spectrum. A British intelligence officer characterizes this approach as "hang the big Nazis and let the little ones go." Of course, this varies from commander to commander. In the Soviet sector of Berlin, the Soviet military authority questions all 12,000 police officers, dismissing most of them. In Saxony, nearly 7,000 former Nazis are removed from the municipal offices after completing a questionnaire. But elsewhere, other Soviet commanders are willing to go against their civil affairs teams and allow Nazis to remain in office as mayors, teachers, and police officers. It soon becomes clear that the Allies simply do not have the resources to denazify Germany by themselves. By December 1946, they will have each devolved responsibility to various German staff denazification commissions. For the next couple of years, the Fragebogen process continues on an enormous scale, so much so that paper shortages are common across the zones. The Americans are unique in stipulating that all German men and women over the age of 18 must complete a simplified version of the Fragebogen known as the Meldebogen. Some 13.5 million people will fill out one or other survey, and some 3.5 million people are restricted from working in public office pending tribunal processes. All in all, at least 16.5 million people are surveyed across the 4 zones. But on all sides, the Allies realize that the scale of the project is unworkable, and that the future of Germany requires turning something of a blind eye to people's Nazi past. The American tribunal system becomes something of a formality, with Germans able to escape sanctions with exoneration statements from someone the US regards as sufficiently anti-Nazi, usually a priest, a communist, or a Jew. Germans call these statements Persilscheine, or Persil certificates, named after the most popular laundry detergent brand in Germany because they wash the Nazi past clean. Of the 3.5 million who pass through the tribunal system, just 2.5% are barred from employment. 1 million are categorized as Mitläufer, or fellow travelers, and asked to pay a nominal fine. As well as the scale, the new context of the Cold War leads both sides of the Iron Curtain to realize they need to win over the Germans rather than punish them. The French give an amnesty in November 1947. The British follow in January 1948, the Soviets in March, and the Americans around the same time. While they still go after some prominent cases, by 1949, denazification is effectively over, with all sides agreeing, either publicly or privately, that it has been a mishandled failure. This means that when the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, is formed in 1949, former Nazis come to occupy many senior positions. I'll quote from Tony Judd's book, Post-War, which gives an excellent account of this period. Not just of the denazification of Germany, but also of how countries like Italy, France, and those in Eastern Europe dealt with fascists and collaborators. Of Germany, he writes the following. By the time the Western Allies abandoned their denazification efforts with the coming of the Cold War, it was clear that these had had a decidedly limited impact. In Bavaria, about half the secondary school teachers had been fired by 1946, only to be back in their jobs 2 years later. In 1949, the newly established Federal Republic ended all investigations of the past behavior of civil servants and army officers. In Bavaria, in 1951, 94% of judges and prosecutors, 77% of finance ministry employees, and 60% of civil servants in the regional agriculture ministry were ex-Nazis. By 1952, 1 in 3 foreign ministry officials in Bonn was a former member of the Nazi Party. Of the newly constituted West German diplomatic corps, 43% were former SS men, and another 17% had served in the SD or Gestapo. Hans Globke, Chancellor Adenauer's chief aide throughout the 1950s, was the man who had been responsible for the official commentary on Hitler's 1935 Nuremberg laws. Outside of the civil service, government, and police, the same holds true. Universities and the legal profession had been staunch supporters of Hitler, but they got off lightly. So too do businessmen and leading industrialists who had profited from serving the Nazi regime. Friedrich Flick, convicted as a war criminal in 1947, was released 3 years later by the West German authorities and restored to his former eminence as the leading shareholder in Daimler-Benz. Senior figures in the incriminated industrial combines of IG Farben and Krupp were all released early and re-entered public life. By 1952, Fordwerke, the German branch of Ford Motor Company, had reassembled all its senior management from the Nazi years. Even the Nazi judges and concentration camp doctors convicted under American jurisdiction saw their sentences reduced or commuted. We've seen this dynamic play out before in Astrid's and Anna's videos about Operations Paperclip and Oslo Viachim. Suddenly, as one war draws to a close and an iron curtain descends upon Europe, Cold War practicalities mean that employing former Nazis is far more palatable. But a reckoning will come, at least in West Germany, but it will not come from abroad and not from the generations that brought about Nazism and the war. In the 1960s, the next generations of Germans will begin to actively address the actions of their parents and grandparents. It will lead to a fundamental change of the West German political landscape that takes special responsibility for the nation's violent extremist history, where a Nazi past or affiliation with neo-Nazi ideas increasingly becomes anathema to a successful public life. East Germany will follow another path, where doctrinal communism will dictate that those who have joined the Soviet sphere are by nature anti-fascist and must not reckon with their collective past because they have become heroes of another authoritarian idea cloaked as an anti-fascist revolution. In 2024, while the public stance remains, and tens of millions of Germans still pledge special responsibility for Germany's Nazi past, in an international climate of rising political extremism, the inoculation against Nazism in the West during the second half of the Cold War is wearing off, and the addition of the unvaccinated Eastern Germans by reunification has given rise to a new cohort of disease. And like in so many places of the world, in both Western and Eastern Germany, there are more and more symptoms of the ugly sickness that catapulted the world into an apocalypse that cost tens of millions of lives. Never forget.